Good morning to you all and welcome to the ACER CEER webinar on the rules to prevent methane leakage in the energy sector. My name is Dennis Hesseling. I work for ACER as head of the Infrastructure, Gas and Retail Department. And together with my colleague Tom Maas from CREG, the Belgian regulator, who is the vice chair of the ACER and also the CEER gas working group, we'll be hosting this webinar for you today. This webinar is on a topic which is, let's say, not a classical regulatory topic, and maybe it's good to spend a few words just to explain the importance of the topic to the extent that it's still needed. This is something which has gained in importance, the methane leakage and methane emissions, recently quite significantly. You can see it, for instance, in the latest report of the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, which really singles out methane emissions as one of the key areas of action where action is required, because methane is both a very potent greenhouse gas and also a gas which has a shorter life in the atmosphere. It's something where if we take action now, we can see the results sooner than any action taken on CO2. Both are needed, but this is a shorter time horizon and you'll see the results earlier. That's an important thing. You also saw it in The Economist, highlighting methane emissions as one of the key areas for action based on the IPCC report. And just this morning, you may have seen Reuters coming out with a piece on the draft still EU-US agreement on how to tackle methane emissions. There's a proposal in draft to cut methane emissions by 1/3 by the end of the decade, and they want to get other big emitting countries, areas on board as well. So it clearly has a significant more attention now than even a few years ago for a very good reason. So we need to get into action. If we look at the methane emissions as an overall topic, we are aware that there are different sources of methane emissions, some from waste, from landfill, some from agriculture, and some from oil and gas. Obviously, the last one is the one that is relevant for us as regulators, and in particular then the transport part. We know that within the oil and gas sector, there are bigger parts which emit more methane emissions than the transport part, but the transport part is where we as regulators come in, because the moment a TSO or a DSO has to take action to reduce, to minimize, to eliminate methane emissions, it becomes a regulatory topic, how to approve this and how to look at the cost involved. That's, let's say, the more narrow focus of the regulatory topics. That's also why it's relatively new. But of course, we want to be prepared once this discussion comes our way, that we know which actions we can take to also solve this part of the puzzle. That's a bit on the introduction of the topic. I will be very happy to introduce the panel to you. We have 3 speakers, and maybe I can get the next slide on the screen, so you can also read them while I introduce the 3 speakers to you. We have, in order of appearance, Marco Lacognata. He's our colleague from ARERA, the Italian regulator. He's also co-chair of the gas decarbonization legislation workstream, and he's been very actively involved in drafting the joint ACER-CEER paper on methane emissions. Then we have Malcolm McDowell. He is team leader at DG Energy, our mother department, working on the topic as well. And as a third speaker, we have Francisco de la Flor, who is a board member of GIE, Gas Infrastructure Europe, and also in Marco Gas. And it means with the 3 of them, we cover both the regulatory, the policy, and the industry angle. And those are the 3 topics that we need to make sure we fully understand the topic and we see which measures are feasible, looking at the more narrow part of gas transmission and distribution. These speakers will get about 8 minutes, as they know. I hope they will stick to the time to make their statements, to introduce the topic from their perspective. Then we'll move to the Q&A. For the Q&A, we'll ask you to submit your questions in the question function in the chat. We will collect them in the meantime. You can already submit questions while the speakers are speaking. We will allocate them to the relevant person. And then once we get to the Q&A, so after about 25 minutes, we'll address them one by one as much as the time allows. And then Tom will take over for the conclusions of the webinar, and that will bring us to, well, 1 hour from now, basically. Before I hand over to Marco as the first speaker, let me mention one more person, and that is Boyko Nitsov, my colleague here at ACER, who's been very active on the topic. He's not with us today. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it for the webinar, but he's one of the persons really shaping the topic from the regulatory perspective. That's it from my side for a short introduction. Welcome again. We're happy to see so many of you joining us for this topic. And let me now hand over to the first speaker, Marco Lacognata.
Thanks, Dennis, and good morning, everyone. Today, I will give you a brief overview of the content of the recent white paper developed jointly by CEER and ACER on methane emissions. Next slide, please. The paper has been published in July and is part of a series of papers on the Green Deal initiative. So I'll really invite you to take a look at the CEER website for the other papers. Also, some reflections or related topics to methane emissions are contained in previous CEER and ACER CEER papers. I, in particular, refer to the one on regulatory issues on the delta in-out, which focuses on the distribution network, as well on the previous Bridge Beyond 2025 position paper, which also contains some reflections on this topic. So as regards the July paper on methane emissions, it is structured, contains recommendations along the main type of actions, for instance, monitoring, detection, and quantification. It basically replicates the structure of the consultation by the European Commission. But today I would like to focus on two main, considerations that are very important from a regulatory perspective, which are the regulatory treatment of costs related to methane emissions and the role of information. I would like to focus on this because the paper develops some reflections on also topics that are not strictly within the remits of regulators. But those two issues are really what NRAs and what regulators will have to face or to focus their work on. Next slide, please. So in terms of the role of information, what we face when we talk about methane emissions is a huge need for information. We, as regulators, do not have very much access to data on the quantity of gas which is emitted through even by regulated entities. And even when we have some data, we are not always able to cross-check, to verify the data that has been provided. We know that there are some operators who, for instance, publish a sustainability report, but we have to take those data there and for granted. So there is a certain information asymmetry in this respect that we all face, and this is the reason why we strongly support the imposition of mandatory monitoring and reporting standards obligations, and possibly through a harmonized methodology, which could be the OGMP 2.0. And also, it would be very helpful to have such data within a common framework, which could be the International Methane Emission Observatory. Of course, information is key, is important to define, to design policy instrument, in particular when those are performance-based, because not only it is needed to take the decisions, but is also the tool itself that has to rely on the information. Of course, we know that we are sometimes overwhelmed by the information we are surrounded by, or we ask even regulated entities. So it is very much important that such information is targeted and useful. In this respect, I would like to stress one important principle that we should follow when setting these targets, which is the principle of proportionality. We know that having or collecting data from regulated entities is not always easy, and we also know that there are very different kind of regulated entities. We have smaller companies, bigger companies. We have the ones that are that feel more the reputational incentives, for instance, and the ones that are less concerned. We also have different kind of infrastructures. So there are local infrastructure like storage or LNG versus distributed and diffuse infrastructure such as transmission or distribution. So we, of course, probably the so-called one-size-fits-all approach for gathering information is not the best option. And in this respect, the different levels or tiers that are envisaged by the methodology, the OGMP methodology, for instance, can really help. And maybe the best way forward would be to design and impose different tiers according to the type of operator or the type of activity that they perform. Of course, NRAs should have access to this data, and because that's fundamental to for our tasks. Next slide, please. So not only is a matter of proportionality, but is also a matter of responsibility. So in terms of costs related to the all activities related to methane emissions, the methane strategy by the European Commission sets a task, let's say, for NRAs, which is mainly the recognition of costs related to such activities. We of course are very aware of the need to cover such costs, because we believe in the importance of mitigating the methane emissions. However, we also know that there are very different approaches in the way in which costs are recovered from regulated entities. There are cases in which costs are passed through. There are cases in which there are incentives in place, like the price cap, or specific incentive mechanisms. So we should take account of that, also considering that there are different type of costs related to methane emissions. We have costs related to the activities of monitoring, of reporting. We have costs related to the investments, for instance, that help mitigate emissions. And we also have the costs related to the commodity being emitted, so the gas which is lost. And maybe, again, we could set up different schemes according to different type of costs. So surely there is the need to help the regulatory, the regulated entities in covering such costs. But on the other hand, we shouldn't forget that NRAs also have the task to recognize the efficiently incurred costs. In this respect, we shouldn't dismiss performance-based mechanism or incentives-based mechanism to the recovery of costs, in particular those related to the emitted commodity. So we do favor initiatives at European level for an harmonized approach to the way in which costs are recovered, but not forgetting that there could be also an issue of cost efficiency, and also the cost-benefit ratio of some of the measures that are implemented. So it shouldn't be, let's say, necessarily a full cost recovery regardless of the type of activity. We should be able to assess the way the type of activity and intervene and design specific regulatory mechanisms. Last, one thing that I didn't mention in the slides, but I would like to mention it for like a future next challenge. It's a sort of link to the planning. So it is also important that and that also relates to the discussion on energy efficiency. So energy efficiency and the measures to the amount of gas which is emitted in infrastructure should also play a role in the way in which we plan infrastructure and decide and assess different infrastructure projects. Currently, there are, of course, CBA methodologies that takes, for instance, the CO2 levels in terms of emissions. We believe that also the amount of natural gas which is emitted should be taken into account, should be internalized in the methodology, and should also be an element to compare also different projects. So that's basically all from my side. I think I stick to the 8 minutes limit, and so I hand over to the next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, Marco, for highlighting the regulator's view on this topic of methane emissions, the importance of proper information, verified information, and how to deal with costs, both a harmonized approach, but also incentives for performance-based. I think these were two clear messages, and as you said, there is more indeed in the paper that we published, which is available online. With that, let's move over to the next speaker from DG ENER, Malcolm McDonald. You have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. Well, it's not the first workshop at which I speak on this topic, and it's it's not a new topic. It's something that I would say was officially launched in terms of setting the priorities and the interests of the Commission with the communication on the methane strategy that was now published a year ago. It seems incredible to think that that was already that communication is already a year old, and in that communication it made it quite clear that not only did the Commission wanted to take a multidisciplinary approach to tackling methane emissions from human activity, and therefore not only focus on methane emissions that are better known and better understood than others from the energy sector, but also to look more broadly at the other high emitting methane sectors. But what it did recognize is that there was a general recognition that time was ripe for legislative action on the energy side, and perhaps for other types of actions, first and foremost, certainly in the agricultural sector. And ever since we put that idea into formal words in that communication, we have yet to come across any stakeholder from any side, regulator or otherwise, who doesn't similarly come up with that same analysis. So time is ripe for legislative action. In many respects, a reflection on what exists today in terms of regulation as regards not only fugitive methane emissions, but also planned methane emissions, demonstrates that there has indeed been a strong focus for many years on CO2 emissions, and for some reason methane has been left by the wayside, and there's a great deal of correction that needs to be done, corrective action that needs to be done to make good on that. And what's most striking is that as regards certainly the scope of emissions that we're looking at, because we're not looking at industrial emissions or sources of methane from industrial plants, but for the scope of emissions that we're looking at, in other words, upstream oil and gas and midstream, downstream gas, there's indeed not only a lack of mitigative regulations, but also a lack of accurate and precise information on the origin and magnitude of the methane emissions. Just this morning, I was reading a new article. It seems that there's a plethora these days of articles on methane emissions, and just if although the point has been made numerous times, it seems it's being made a lot through the news these days. We're not even aware of the levels of methane emissions, it seems, in the places where we always told ourselves that that was very much under control. So, for instance, around residential areas, and the article I was reading was about methane emissions being calculated by academics in Utrecht, in the Netherlands, one of the most populous countries in the EU, and they were finding levels of methane emissions, accidental levels of methane emissions that they couldn't know the origin of, but suspected, no doubt, came from distribution network that were 500 times higher than the normal levels of methane emissions. So that's an example among others that tells us that we have a serious lack of understanding of the problem, even in those parts where we should have a very good understanding of it, residential areas. We've perhaps assumed too much that all the correct regulations have been put in place, at least for safety reasons, as regards methane leakage, and perhaps that's not completely true. We've assumed too much in the past, perhaps, that methane was leaks in methane needed to be dealt with principally from the point of view of a safety aspect. We now realize that it's not just a safety aspect, it's a local pollution aspect, it's a climate changing aspect, and in many respects, a lot of us are waking up to this, and to the point that that it's in terms of what's required and what the recognition of what's required, we're starting to hear things like, perhaps even common international action, as Dennis Hessling clarified, mentioning global methane pledge, for instance. So the recognition that this is not just a local problem, it's a global problem, and like every other climate changing gas, it needs to be tackled internationally, not just locally. To give you a quick update on where we're at with regards to the energy-based methane emissions focused legislative proposals, we still have the intention of adopting those proposals before the end of the year, along with a gas regulatory package and the new hydrogen regulation. And currently what we're working on is finalizing the impact assessment and concurrently drafting the legislative proposals. As regards the most important points highlighted by Marco Laconiata on behalf of ACER and CEER, I would welcome as much detail as you can give us as regards the issue of taking into account the costs for regulated entities. So I'm not an expert on the different methods that you were talking about. I think it might even be useful for us to have a dedicated meeting on that for us and the rest of the team to find out more about how we could tackle that in our upcoming legislative proposals. So to go into more detail on these things, I think that would be a good idea to do in the coming weeks. But otherwise, I think in terms of the contents of the proposals, we've been making it clear throughout since the communication. There'll be very much an MRV element as well as a methane abatement element, and it will cover all the main sources of methane emissions in the energy sector not currently covered by existing legislation. So it'll be very much relevant, as I said, to oil and gas upstream and gas mid and downstream. And if the schedule is kept, if we keep to the schedule rather, as I said, then we will hopefully adopt by December, and at some point next year, when it's decided among the presidencies which of them takes up this topic, then we will start discussions with the other institutions on the second step of the legislative process. Any clarifications on anything else as regards to the process that I can give, please submit to any questions to me on that. Be happy to try to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malcolm, for covering the wide policy area that DG Ener has to cover here with the measures under preparation, going all the way from the distribution level to the global level. It's quite a far reach. It was interesting to hear an example about the recent academic research in Utrecht in the Netherlands. Just for the anecdote, I happen to work on safety regulations for gas distribution networks in the Netherlands, so including Utrecht, 15 years ago. And I can confirm what your hypothesis is, that the focus was very much on safety. We didn't at the time look or consider any pollution aspects or climate change aspects. It was purely to make sure that the operation would be done in a safe way. I think that was pretty much achieved, but probably it is not sufficient to also tackle local, as you were saying, local pollution and climate change aspects. Thank you for that. Let's move on to the third, but not last speaker, Francisco de la Flor from GIE and Marco Gas, giving us the industry perspective on methane emissions. Francisco, you have the floor.
Yes, good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to participate and share our views and thoughts. The ones from the industry perspective angle, as you say, Dennis, the European infrastructure operators. Yes, you can take, Christina, the first page, please. Just the front, not the front, the front page. The front. We stay at the front page, please. We are okay. It was the front. Was another one. No, stay here. We are well aware that the goal is to the actual abatement of emissions and and every stakeholder has to contribute, including us, the midstreamers. Marco said, and this is a global topic, and the efforts have to be done in such a way that the reductions are produced as fast as possible in a cost-efficient manner, allocating the resources where the reductions can be achieved in this fastest way. So what can we do? Basically, what we are already doing. This is true. Methane emissions management is not new for all companies. For decades, it was addressed for safety reasons. Then for commercial, don't forget that methane has a value, and nowadays for this environmental edge. So I will use some materials to illustrate what we do and what we propose. Next, please, Christina. How do we contribute to manage and to reduce emissions? Actions, as in the title. Well, there are 4 areas of activities: using the available, appropriate, and suitable technical tools, while sharing knowledge and innovating, cooperating among the stakeholders, and actively working in the dissemination of the activities to leverage among others. On the left-hand side, I copied the front page of the report, a very complete report that was prepared 2 or 3 years ago, on how the industry could contribute. I invite those of you that do not have read it yet, just please do it. It is available in the web pages of the Madrid Forum for Gas Regulation, where it was presented, as well as in the web pages of Marco Gas and GI. Next, please. Next page. Okay, I will not stop stressing that cooperation among stakeholders is key. For instance, on the bottom left-hand side, you find the logos of the players engaged in the preparation of the referred report, representing all segments of the value chain, association representing hundreds of companies, European and also worldwide companies, from upstream to utilization, and including LNG and biogas. On the bottom right-hand side of the page, the document, a living document where we collect the list of actions, several dozens of them, with contributions by stakeholders, giving continuity to the report. Again, available and well-deserving a look. On top, we represent a sample of concrete actions developed to disseminate and raise awareness, including, by the way, training programs with a number of companies, as much as we can do. The reactions we have to this is just thankful for the efforts. Next, please. Let me also refer to some of the products elaborated among our specialists to contribute to raise the knowledge and assist the companies to address the reductions of emissions. Some titles: glossary, the use of the same language and understand concepts in the same manner; technical guidance to assess methane emissions in accordance with harmonized and transparent methodology; guidelines for target setting; technical recommendations on LDAR; technical recommendations on venting and flaring; best practices guides for identification, detection, procurement, and quantification; best practices guides in the transmission, storage, LNG terminals, and distribution. So quite a number of concrete tools, just to say the main ones. Next, please. More actions. More actions in the field of data accuracy and reporting, and I agree with Marco that this is completely essential. And we are particularly active, as you know, in the OGMP 2.0 partnership. If you see the webpage, the UNEP webpage, the majority of signatory members are from our segment, the midstreamers belonging to or linked to our two associations, EIE and Marco Gas. We know that we represent a very, very small part of the emissions, but this engagement shows the commitment of our relatively small companies. We do actively participate in the 3 open working areas of task forces or GMP 2.0, the reporting template, the technical guidance documents, and uncertainty and reconciliations. Finally, let me refer to the technologies to detect and measure, a sample of them in pictures pasted in the bottom side of this slide. For instance, we are working in these days in a project to evaluate technologies, its accuracy, suitability, and reconciliations of results. Then quite concrete actions, not only words and papers, but site work. Regarding OGMP 2.0 and the layers and levels, yeah, we have to work on those activities. The work is in progress. There is limited experience with level 5 for the majority of operators. So, and we have a lot of pressure. So we have to work together, and we will get to the best outcome. Then next, please, Cristina, to finish my intervention, just some final thoughts and to highlight and summarize. We GI and Marco Gas have contributed to a better understanding of the methane emissions in the gas sector, as well as to build a culture of curbing methane emissions. The establishment of a well-structured, robust, fit-for-purpose MRV system is key. We support the appropriate translation on the OGMP 2.0 framework into EU regulation. In parallel, companies should set individual targets together with their methane emissions mitigation strategies, while further emissions reductions are achieved. Appropriate and efficient LDAR programs and minimizing unventing and flaring when possible should be the priorities, because they go to the actual reductions. Flexibility and recognition that one type of solution doesn't fit all the assets, operations, and equipment along the value chains is required. The most cost-efficient and most optimal methane emission reductions actions should be prioritized, as you also refer somehow. At the last, of course, not least, for regulated entities, I will not go into detail. We were just reading and analyzing the document prepared by ACER and CEER. Just the investment on this MRV, LDAR, and mitigation measures undertaken by infrastructure operators. You are aware that the knowledge and recognizing of this within the scope of regulated entities by national regulatory authorities is a must. And probably stressing that please allocate the resources. Allocate the resources where we can get the fastest emission reductions, wherever those emission reductions should be produced. We remain open. I have participated in dozens of events in the past 2 years, so and we remained open to contribute to the cooperation, either just participating in these activities, but especially in the day-to-day interactions with the stakeholders and the authorities. So we remain open for this continued cooperation and detailed cooperation. Thanks for listening. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Thanks for participating also in this virtual event next to all the other ones that you have covered over the last year or so. What I get from your presentation is, first of all, there's a lot of activities going on in the industry on this particular topic, which is really very welcome. We need the industry on board to make sure that all the technical expertise is delivered to show what is possible and what may be not possible or not so efficient. And what I also get from your presentation is that when it comes to the topics that Marco mentioned, information, data provision, verification of data, and investment for transmission operators being recognized in a particular way, I think on those principles we're pretty much aligned. So I don't see a big clash here. I think it's more a matter of getting into action, making sure this happens and happens in time, and then we look to the Commission indeed for the legislation to be put in place. Having said that, I think we have now finished and nicely in time. Thank you all three for that. The panel introductions. We've covered regulatory, policy, and industry perspectives. We have 5 questions which came in so far, and let's use the, let's say, next 20 minutes or so to go through them. The first one is for Marco, and that's a question from Yves Folsenet, who's saying that data quality is indeed key. How could you ensure that the objective is reached? Could it be done through a tariff incentive? And he mentioned that it is different from the cost of the lost commodity. So maybe, Marco, you can explore, elaborate a bit more on the topic of how to ensure data quality and when to use incentives towards regulated entities.
Yes, so from our perspective, I think that data quality is better achieved through some kind of mandatory provisions. Instead, incentives are can be better suited for finding the optimal solutions in terms of mitigating measures. So what I mean is that so for instance, first of all, data quality is a matter where operators do not necessarily have strong incentives to improve the data quality. And why is that? Because what we think is that in several cases, improving data quality means increasing the level of emissions which are reported. Of course, it's not always the case, but we feel that there is an overall, let's say, under measurement of emissions associated with a more basic and simple measuring methodology. So in this case, as I said, mandatory provisions would be better suited. While on the other hand, we see incentives better placed. For instance, today there are cases where the operators do not have, so in most cases, operators do not have any responsibility over the gas which is lost. So the cost of the lost gas is usually a pass-through component of the system, which is paid by the end users. But we also have cases where the TSO or the DSO, less likely the DSOs, but usually TSOs face some risk associated to this emitted quantity, for instance, because the NRA has set a standard methodology for setting the allowed losses. And there, of course, there's an incentive for the operator to outperform the standard emission factors, so to reduce the emissions. So that's what I had in mind when I talked about performance or incentives-based tools for some of the costs. For instance, the cost of the emitted related to the emitted commodity. So to give some kind of responsibility, maybe not, of course, not a full responsibility, but some sort of responsibility to the operators over the commodity which is emitted, may help in finding the most cost-efficient and cost-effective ways of mitigating emissions. We do not want to define very precise or specific investments or type of investments or mitigating measures as regulators, because we know that those are very technology specific and technology evolves. So that's the area where maybe other kind of incentives are better suited. On the other hand, on data quality, I think that we can rely on mandatory provisions. I also see
for clarifying this. I think it's good indeed to separate between the mandatory part and the incentive part. There is one more question which just came in indeed on the same topic, so maybe you want to pick that one up as well. It's a question from Nicola Batilana on saying, in addition to the recognition of investments for the prevention of emissions, can additional incentives be provided for regulated entities? So additional incentives for regulated entities like TSOs or DSOs.
Well, as I said, incentives related to the quantity of gas which is emitted, so giving a sort of risk, which can also translate to, of course, a risk always entails a potential loss or a potential profit. So that can be an incentive for regulated entities to reduce the level of emissions below the threshold which is set by the NRA. I think that could help. Of course, I said that on data quality, usually mandatory provisions are best. Of course, incentives related to data quality can also be set, or in terms of the number of activities which are performed. So not related to the outcome in terms of the quantity of gas emitted, but by thinking of the outcome as, for instance, the number of inspections, or just like that. So the activities. So I think that output-based or performance-based requirements can also be, or incentives can also be set in terms of the activities performed. Even though maybe a bit less skeptical about that, because it's not always easy to find the reference, the benchmark, because we have standard emission factors, but it's more difficult to find, let's say, standard inspections per kilometer per year. It really much depends on several things, so it's more difficult to find a benchmark there, but it's possible.
Thanks a lot, Marco, for elaborating on that one. We have a handful of questions for Malcolm on the policy part, so maybe let's move over to Malcolm here. And the first one is a question by Alex Barnes. What is the Commission doing in relation to international initiatives or cooperation, for instance, referring to this Reuters report on the EU-US deal?
Sorry, what is the question exactly with reference to these international initiatives?
So you can read the questions in the chat. If you open the chat, you can also see it. The question is, I'll read it again. What is the Commission doing in relation to international initiatives or cooperation, for instance, as reported by Reuters on an EU-US deal?
The Commission is very active. As announced in the communication on the methane strategy, we made it clear that if we were to be successful in dealing with the methane emissions problem, we had to act on two major fronts. One was to ensure that we have the right legislation in place to deal with emissions that are occurring as a result of the consumption of fossils in Europe. And on the other hand, the second front was a recognition that a great deal of the emissions linked to fossil fuel consumption in Europe were occurring outside of the EU territory, and therefore that it was extremely important for us, if we were to really truly tackle all those methane emissions linked to fossil fuel consumption in EU, that we develop international diplomatic action to try to ensure that our energy partners are also committed to reducing methane emissions. I would say it's fair to say that we are expending a lot of effort right now in preparation for the next COP in Glasgow in November, and for trying to get other countries on board to commit to similar ambition as we have outlined in the communication, whether it's about trying to talk about regulatory equivalence, trying to commit other countries to take the same sort of approach that we want to be taking through future EU legislation, or whether it's to ask other countries to similarly provide funding towards the IMEO in order to ensure that it's set up and functioning as soon as possible, and bring this much needed transparency on, first of all, energy related methane emissions, and then expanded to other sectors. So the Commission is involved in a lot of initiatives, both on the bits that I'm talking about, that I'm working on, and on the more international action.
Thank you, Malcolm. There's a question actually which relates to this. It's a bit more specific. It's question number 4 in our chat, which is from François ACER, and he says, despite insufficiently documented methane emissions by the international oil companies, so let's say the Western ones, they are more reliably reported than the NOCs, the national oil companies. Is another very high risk that stringent regulations imposed by the EU would again penalize its own industry, as has been the case, he claims, for other sectors? What are the EU options for this not to happen? So not to penalize the own industry compared to others who may be reporting less than what the standard may become inside the EU.
Well, our experience with CO2 shows that it's something that we're more and more concerned about. Why are we putting in place measures to ensure that we try to have as much a level playing field? It would be completely unfair, of course, for exporters of energy to the Europe to be more positively favored than our own industry, in spite of the fact that in the context of oil and gas consumption, we produce very little compared to what we import. And that's part of another aspect of the equation, which we need to be very much aware of the fact that we are highly energy dependent, certainly as regards fossil fuels consumption. And there's also, I think, the general agreement between people, even ambitious people, with regards to the phase out of fossil fuels, that we're not about to significantly reduce our energy mix overnight, and therefore that in due course the fossil fuels that we consume must be as sustainable as they can be. If it makes sense to talk about sustainable fossil, and I believe it does make sense. Understanding the methane problem highlights that there are different levels of sustainability of fossils, for sure. And hence, really, the answer to your first question, the reason why it's extremely important for us to take this dual approach of strong legislation in the EU, but strong action too at the level of the international. It just wouldn't be acceptable given the heightened climate change need for action, the upcoming COP. That we would give the impression that we only care about what's happening in the EU. Climate change is a global issue, and we shouldn't forget that we're one of the biggest consumers of fossil in the world. So I fully agree with the intention behind the question of this person. We're fully aware of it. But it's also not easy. We don't have a great deal of experience in the EU as regards regulating the means of production when it comes to oil or gas in other parts of the world. So we need to approach it in a reasonable way that has a chance of success, as opposed to one which is unrealistic. We have no interest, the Commission, in putting forward proposals which have little chance of success. So I need to point that out as well.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Indeed, it's a tricky area. It's clear that action needs to be taken globally, not just inside the EU, and not to penalize EU industry. We have some power probably as a big EU consumer, as you said, and still it's not directly, let's say, ours to regulate the whole world, and that makes it a bit of a tricky situation. But I hear that the Commission is clearly aware of this and is trying to mitigate this where possible. We have a very lively Q&A, and I'm trying to summarize a few questions, otherwise we'll not get to the end of it. There's a number of them which I'll put together for you, Malcolm, which is about the scope and the timing of the new legislation which the Commission is preparing. So the question is, what sources of methane emissions are you considering to include in the proposals? What is the timing of these proposals, and what is then the role that you refer to of the next presidency once it makes it to that stage?
So with regards to the scope, I think we made it clear in the communication. We're very much focused on oil, gas, and coal. So I spoke about what parts of the oil and gas supply chain, upstream oil and gas, midstream, downstream gas, and coal methane emissions. Of course, an extremely important source of methane emissions in the EU. It just would make sense to tackle just oil and gas. We may not have anything like the OGMP in the coal sector, but I think we can develop something like it. And I see no reasons today, certainly, why there shouldn't be both MRV as well as mitigative actions on the side of coal methane emissions in EU legislation. And then as regards the timeline, well, we know our own timeline as regards the Commission, and the timeline today is, as I said, the intention is to adopt still in December. With regards to when which presidency decides to take up the topic and under which presidency, and therefore when exactly the discussions with the other institutions will begin, it's difficult to say. Our understanding is that the French presidency will rather be focusing on the the many different the various proposals, the numerous proposals that came out this summer already as part of the Fit for 55 package, that would then mean that whatever would come in December would rather be dealt in the second part of next year as opposed to the first part. That's my understanding, but I can't say much more than that. I wouldn't want to be quoted on it. I don't know exactly. Things might change perhaps, so it's difficult to say when exactly we will enter the second part of the legislative process.
Yeah, I think it's clear that you outlined the overall process, but there's some uncertainty, of course, to which topics the different presidencies may take up, starting with the French one as of beginning of next year. There's a question to Francisco from Frida Kinninger, who is referring to a recent random sample of so-called FLIR camera footage, which is showing that midstream methane emissions can be significant, and she's referring to examples in Italy and Romania. The question is, do you have an assessment about the condition of infrastructure in the different EU member states that could give an indication where today for the risk for leaky infrastructure in Europe is higher than in other places? So based on these camera footage, which indeed was quite telling, but of course it's anecdotal, it gives a few impressions. Do we know more? Do we have proper data available maybe across Europe to see where transmission infrastructure is, or distribution infrastructure is leaking, and where it is quite solid?
Thanks. Quite a long question, Frida. I presume you are from Food and Water Watch. I see. I think that in terms of leakages, if we compare the European landscape with other places in the world, I mean, I don't have data, but I mean, very accurate and comparable data. But what I guess is we are could be we certainly are not the worst, or we are probably the best ones, because we are aware of this, and because we have during many years we have done, many of the operators have done a lot of work in this sense, so that Europe is doing the homework. We we account for, I'm not going to say a negligible, but a very, very small amount of global emissions, which is the important point. Those so-called super emitters are responsible for 70 or 80%, and we maybe in total for some points or some comma points, so that yes, there are people just checking with cameras, with the new toys, just checking what is happening in different places, and places where, for instance, could be also waste water treatment plants, or many others, or other natural sources, or dams. So that what is important is that we are aware, that the industry and all the stakeholders are aware, are putting the means. I just mentioned a lot of tools we have in place, and especially we can contribute to this abatement in the places and with the companies, certainly not in Europe, that are responsible for the vast majority. And let me repeat that we have to do the homework. We are doing the homework, but it is important to allocate the resources properly in such a way that the effectiveness of every euro spent is the highest. Thanks. Thanks, Frida.
Thanks for elaborating on this. We have still a number of questions for Marco, and also looking at the clock, because we have only 6 minutes left. Marco, I would propose to maybe tackle 2 of the questions which are on your plate. One is an interesting one by Benjamin Duvel, who's asking how will good performance, meaning a low level of emissions for transmission companies, distribution companies in the past, be rewarded or recognized? So those who did well, how will that be expressed, let's say, through maybe a regulatory system? And the other question I would pick here maybe is the one on the European Methane Emissions Observatory, question by Marshall Hall, question 15 in our list, was asking that, well, if NRAs would get access already to verify data, why do they still need this European Methane Emissions Observatory? is it still needed then? Maybe those two, Marco.
Yeah, okay. Okay, fine. So on good performance in the past, of course, that goes into the details of how those measures would be implemented. So we didn't go as far as discussing this, but in principle, it's not a matter of rewarding necessarily rewarding the best operators. It's a matter of reducing emissions. So I would say that if an operator is already performing well, that means that, for instance, if we set a standard, is already meeting that standard, that's fine, because there's also, we should take into account that a certain level of emission is inevitable. So of course that standard can be lowered in the future, so there still be some kind of incentive, but I don't think there will be possible to reward for something that happened in the past. And as regards the IMEO, we don't have currently access to data or not. It really depends on the framework, on the legislative framework in each country. There are cases where NRA has some kind of access to the data, but what we saw is that typically those kind of data are not available directly to the NRA. So of course, it's a matter of having the data and having them in a common format and having them verified. So the European approach could help in having this single framework in which data are available for anyone. But of course, it's in the end is just a matter of having data which are quality data. I also see two other questions. I don't know if we have time.
Yeah, we're running out of time. Maybe a final word if you want to say, and then I'll hand over to Tom for the closing words.
Okay. Now, in terms of the costs, I just wanted to be clear on that currently in most systems, the losses are pass-through costs. So they're paid by the end users. And typically, same is for investments, because in most cases, when an operator puts makes some investment, those are included in the RAB. So mitigating measures comes at a cost, but they also benefit the end users, because currently they are the ones that they pay for the commodity. What we are saying is that if we also put some kind of, we also make the operators pay for to a certain degree for the emitted commodity, we may end up maybe finding the optimal mitigating opportunities, because they would look for the most cost-effective solutions also from their perspective. So that's the thing, but there are no special plans for cost recovery now. So emissions have been treated like normal operations by TSOs. We never set a spotlight on mitigating emissions costs. Now we are doing that because we think that we might face a lot of attention and maybe costs in the future, so we might want a special a spotlight, I would say, not necessarily a special regime, but certainly we would like to to have some kind of increased oversight, NRA oversight over such activities.
Thank you, Mario, for your final elaboration, and also for highlighting the kind of hidden costs which are already in the system, which consumers are already paying nowadays through, let's say, the overall tariffication system. I think it should indeed be taken into account when designing the new system and incentivizing the operators where that is useful. With that, let me hand over to Tom, Tom Maas, Vice Chair of the ACER and CEER Gas Working Group, for the final word. Tom, you're muted. I still cannot hear Tom. I'm not sure if I'm the only one. No, can't hear him. Tom, we can't hear you. Can you, in some way, make sure your audio is audible? We heard you before, but now I don't hear you anymore.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, now it's good.
Sorry. No, so I was saying that indeed everyone has to play its role to contribute to the process that we currently see in the energy sector, a moment of innovation, transition and transformation. So methane, of course, is considered to be one of the largest contributors to global warming, and therefore discussing its reduction in the light of decarbonizing the system should be one of our top priorities. And I'm very happy that today our fellow speakers have enabled us to get an overview of what's being done in the various different layers. We started with Marco sharing with us the regulator's perspective on the topic, namely by highlighting some of the principles and rules that should guide our way to prevent methane leakage in the energy sector. I think it's clear that this harmonized approach and the combination of some mandatory measures also with incentives and especially the efficiency of the measures will be of utmost importance for regulators to evaluate the measures presented or proposed by the industry. So indeed, on his presentation was then followed by an overview of what we may expect in the upcoming hydrogen and gas decarbonization legislative package, will we likely be seeing published at the end of the year. And I think it's already clear that from the previous strategy that the European Commission has set very ambitious targets, and it's putting all its efforts into this commitment, not only within Europe, but also on the international scene and the diplomatic efforts with counterparties which are providing energy to Europe. So in order also to be ready and to contribute to the Paris Agreement and the upcoming COP in Glasgow this year. So finally, with Francisco de la Flor, we also had the chance to have the industry perspective, and he has also shown us some of the challenges that the industry is currently facing and how they are trying to tackle them. So I think here as well the increased awareness is there. Now it's time to come to action, and also together, I think, with regulators, with policymakers, I believe we can have a serious impact on these problem issue of methane emissions. So I would like to express my appreciation for what was being presented here today, and also I would like to confirm that as regulators we are committed to putting our efforts into these challenges that the energy sector will face, ensuring a level playing field, the functioning of the markets, and of course also the protection of energy consumers. So to do, we will continue to follow these discussions, promote others like the one today. And to conclude, I would simply like to thank all the participants for their interest, also the lively participation in the Q&A session. I'd like to thank Dennis, Marco, Malcolm, Francisco for sharing their expertise on such a relevant topic. And finally, of course, also like to thank Andra and Christina from the CEER Secretariat for this extensive support in the organization of such a successful event. So thank you all, and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.